Hey everybody, welcome to Zene 62 and on a Thursday, starting to mix up my days here, but without any further ado, I want to introduce a person I've worked to get on my show for a while now, and I'm proud to say that he's here. And he is Alex Epstein. Alex Epstein has written this incredible book called The Moral Case for Fossil Fuels. And I think it's a breath of fresh air at a time when it seems like our discussions have become slanted and without, for want of a better term, you know, exchange of facts or ideas in a respectable way. Uh, Alex is the founder of the Center for Industrial Progress and energy expert. Alex, did I get that right?
Sounds great. Thanks for having me.
Hey, nice to have you here. Hey, Alex, tell my viewers how you came to write the book, which was published in 2014, The Moral Case for Fossil Fuels.
Okay, well, it's a long story, but the short version of it is that, let's see, in about 2007, I had a realization that seems obvious, but that I don't think most of us understand, which is that energy is the industry that powers every other industry, which means that the more energy we have, the more productive every aspect of life becomes. And ultimately, having a lot of energy versus having a little or no energy is the difference between a machine labor civilization, where we have all these machines that produce all this stuff that make us very prosperous and safe, versus a manual labor civilization, which is what primitive and poor places have, where they're very vulnerable to nature and where they have very few resources. So I became very interested in the question of what are the right kinds of decisions to make about energy going forward. And what I found was that when people would talk about certain forms of energy, like fossil fuels and nuclear, they tended to only look for negative impacts. And when they talked about certain forms like solar and wind, they tended to only look for positive impacts. And this is my background is philosophy. This is just a really bad thinking method in general, and it was particularly disturbing for energy because energy is so important. So I was really interested in looking at the overall, like the full impact of all of these different forms of energy. And when I did that, I was pretty surprised that I had a very positive estimate of fossil fuels. And I actually concluded that if we intelligently use fossil fuels, we can benefit by using more of them versus radically restricting them, like people like Tom Steyer talk about. So then some people became interested in those ideas. I debated some prominent people. An agent found me and pitched the book to Penguin, and they liked the idea. So then in 2014, The Moral Case for Fossil Fuels came out.
What has the reception to the book been like for you so far over the last 4 or 5 years?
In general, it's really rewarding. I mean, of course, there are lots and lots of people who say critical things, but I've been getting that since I used to go to Duke, and I would write a column. And in those days, this was, I guess, 99 when I had a column as a sophomore in college, and you would only see letters to the editor. There wasn't any kind of modern social network like there is now. And I would have controversial ideas, and people would, you get like a bunch of negative things, and no one would say anything positive. So I'm used to negative stuff, but, I just get thousands and thousands of people telling me, oh, you changed the way I think. And in particular, what compliment that I get that I really appreciate is people like two aspects of the book. One is, and they're related. So one is what I mentioned, that I'm really looking at the full impact of technology instead of just trying to look at the negative impact or just look at the positive impact. And then the other is that I'm always focused on the end goal of what I call human flourishing. So I want the outcome, I want the impact that's going to be best overall for human life. And what I find is that most of our discussion these days is always talking about the environment, but it's talking about the environment in a way that's often detached from human life. It's focused on just how are we changing the rest of nature, and it's somehow wrong to change nature and this kind of thing. And my view of the environment is I think about the human environment. I think about I want planet Earth to be the best possible place for human beings to live, and for that matter, I want Laguna Beach, where I live, to be the best place for us to live, and I want Oakland to go to the terminal point that we're going to talk about to be the best place for people in Oakland to live. And that means that when I'm looking at industry, I'm looking at ways in which industry can make life better and worse. And what I find is when I look at that in that kind of full impact way, industry makes our lives and really our human environment a much, much better place. It's really upsetting that people just view industry as somehow bad for our environment. They have a very anti-human, anti-progress approach. So I'm glad to counteract that in general, and then in particular with this issue of fossil fuels, that's really the engine of all of progress today. 85% of the energy in the world. So it's particularly important to have for people to have a much more positive estimate of fossil fuels because they have all these positive impacts that aren't being acknowledged.
Yeah, and when I read your book, I don't get that you're saying that there's no such thing as climate change. My thought is that you're saying to the world that we have a great energy technology that isn't fully understood or appreciated, and here's what it's done for us, and here are the changes you need to think about. Am I characterizing that correctly?
Yeah, but I would with the climate issue is the perfect issue to make this point about like a human flourishing focused view of environment, what I think of it as the human environment. So from the perspective of climate, my climate goal is for us to have the safest, most livable climate possible. And that's not the same as an unchanging climate or even a climate that we don't impact. We impact climate in all sorts of ways. I mean, we put ourselves in these artificial climate bubbles through heating and air conditioning. Our industrial activities even warm up cities considerably, actually far more than any kind of global impact do at this point. So we really want to think about how do we make our surroundings the best place possible. And when we're doing that, we have to recognize the natural state is not a good enough state. Nature doesn't give us a safe climate and we just make it dangerous. It gives us a very dangerous climate, and we need to make it safe. So when people talk about climate change, I think it's too vague and it's too focused on this idea of we shouldn't change anything. Versus I'm focused on climate safety, climate livability, and what that points to is a lot of the things fossil fuels do, like powering heating and air conditioning, or powering the transport of water to alleviate droughts, or powering the building of buildings, or powering storm warning systems. Actually, overall, they make us way safer from climate. So even if they've made it a little bit warmer, which is sometimes good, sometimes not, like their overall impact on a livable climate is positive. And so if you start restricting fossil fuels without having really better alternatives, people's climate experience is going to be worse. They're going to be much more in danger, and this is what you have in the poor parts of the world. They are really in danger from climate, and fundamentally it's because they don't have the energy and industrial civilization to protect themselves.
We're on with Alex Epstein, and our discussion is the, I would call the predicament of mankind, myself, and others would call it the discussion we need to have today. And it brings us to a segue, I think, of into the Alex, I just need to do a station break for 1 moment. Hold on a second, please. 1 moment.
Sure.
1 moment. 1 moment. Alex, you there?
I am.
Okay. Just checking. I got it. I've had a bit of a concern with what's going on here with, hold on a second. There. Okay. Okay, good. It's working. All right, back to it. And we're back. Okay, folks. Wanted to make sure that a little diagnostic was working as I wanted it to, and it is. So, Alex, let's resume.
All right.
Cool. Now, you were saying that the issue for you is more of a humanist approach. And I wanted to use that in the conversation we had to move right into a discussion regarding the Oakland bulk and oversized terminal, or what some would call the coal in Oakland, if there really is, if it's really fair to put it that way, conversation. And I have to explain that I've been involved in this since 1993. To make a long story short, Alameda County Supervisor Keith Carson put me on the Alameda Base Reuse Committee, and the committee was responsible for managing the closure of military bases, including the Oakland Army base, where the Oakland Oversized terminal will go. And that was 1993. We waited essentially this long to begin the process of replacing those jobs. I was at the groundbreaking for Oakland Global, of which OBIT is a part, or OBOT, excuse me, is a part. And it's disappointing that we have gotten to this place, and all that has been achieved, you could call it that, over that period of time, is the unfortunate development of a gigantic homeless population not far away from the site. People who would benefit from the type of jobs that we were charged with replacing so many decades ago. So we have a crisis from my point of view, and it turns out that Alex actually knows about the project. So, Alex, I want to ask you a question.
Sure.
What is wrong with a deep water port that takes commodities, not just coal, iron ore, others, from rail to ship for delivery via vessels overseas? Where is the environmental damage in this idea? And more pointedly, can this be done bringing coal in through Oakland?
So let me give you how I think of the question, how I simplify all of this, which is, will this terminal make Oakland a better place to live or a worse place to live? That's the core question. We can talk about if it makes Oakland a better place to live, but we can somehow save all of humanity by stopping it. That seems really implausible and is in fact nonsense. But the first question, particularly for the people in Oakland, is, will this terminal make it a better place to live or a worse place to live? So we look at what's going on here. What this terminal is this is a new productive project. And the type of project it is a transport project. And a new transport project usually occurs when you figure out a more efficient way to transport valuable goods from point A to point B. And so in this case, there are a bunch of valuable materials, including coal, which we'll talk about, and then other materials, that it's much more efficient to get from the U.S. to overseas, where they really, really want it. That's why they're paying for it. It's more efficient to do it by building this deep, large terminal, which can make Oakland a major port. Can make it. There's all sorts of impacts, positive impacts in that respect. But essentially, they figured out a better way to ship different kinds of materials, and part of it, it's a better way in terms of it's more cost effective, and at least the way they're doing it, it's also far cleaner, because the way they're doing it is they're shipping the materials in either these covered cars or just sealed containers. So they're holding cargo shipping to just, I believe, overly high standards. I think I'm actually worried that they're holding them to such high standards that it'll compromise the productivity of the project, and that's an issue, because if the project becomes less efficient, then that compromises its ability to help you. But certainly, there's almost nothing like this in terms of how they're taking every precaution to prevent not only coal dust, but a lot more dangerous substances that could be emitted in any quantity just falling off a car. So it's this sort of unprecedented situation of like these sealed cars, plus by transporting things on rail, you're replacing a lot of transport by truck, and just transporting something by rail is far more efficient, has far less emissions than transporting something by truck. So essentially what you have a project that's really a can't miss type of thing, because in every respect it's superior, it's more cost effective, and it's cleaner, which means that all it's going to do to the people in Oakland in particular is it's going to make their lives better, because it's going to generate new productive job opportunities, which means that a whole bunch of people can get new jobs. And then that also generates a whole bunch of business for other businesses. And opportunity is just a magic thing, because the more opportunity you have, the more productive you can be. You can afford more medical care, you can afford better opportunity to do that. Plus, it creates a general sense of a perception of Oakland that Oakland is a good place to do business versus if you have a project that started in 1993 and still hasn't gotten done, who's going to want to start new things in Oakland? This is like in California, it's hard to start a yoga studio. So a lot of people go to Texas to do other things. So this is just such a good thing across the board. So if I ask my question again, will this terminal make Oakland a better place to live or a worse place to live? It'll make it across the board a better place to live because of more opportunity and considerable environmental improvement and a lot of positive long-term reputational consequences.
Count me with something that I've heard again and again and again regarding the subject of the Oakland bulk and oversized terminal, and that is that it will increase the incidence of asthma in West Oakland. Have you ever heard of any situation like that? I mean to ask the question to be derisive of anyone who asked it. I think it's something to be discussed, and I don't want to be mischaracterized that way, but I do want to get the idea out there to find out what the truth is about this sort of perception.
Well, it's kind of a funny answer, actually, because the only way in which it could cause increased asthma is if asthma is increased by lowering emissions. So definitely lowering air emissions. So if lowering air emissions increases asthma, then maybe it increases asthma. And the reason it's kind of funny is because we actually don't really know the relationship between emissions and asthma. For example, I testified I was living in San Francisco. I guess I lived there for about 2 years. And I guess the last time I was there, one of the last times I was there, maybe 6 months ago or 9 months ago, I was testifying about the Clean Power Plan. And I remember talking about this letter that somebody sent to me from Nancy Pelosi. And Nancy Pelosi said, like, asthma's on the rise. Therefore, we have to reduce emissions. And I just said, well, statistically, I show this in my book, this is well known, emissions have been plummeted. So if plummeting emissions are correlated with a rise in asthma, how is cutting emissions more going to prevent a rise in asthma? So I don't think, because asthma is caused by a whole bunch of environmental factors. But the key thing is it's going to make the air cleaner, not dirtier. And also, if you're concerned about health, the number one thing you need to be concerned about, if you're concerned about health, is not these tiny little differences in what particles in the air or not. You need to be concerned about your level of prosperity, because prosperity is the ultimate lifesaver. The more resources you have, the more you can be proactive about your health, the better food you can afford, the better medical care you can afford. This is why things like cancer rates go down as affluence goes up. So it's particularly cruel to make the people of Oakland poor and say it's for their health. You basically can't do that. You can't make someone healthier by impoverishing them.
On that note as well, is it that have we made this conversation so much of, and when I say a moral discussion, that it's difficult to have a reasonable conversation anymore? Because when you have someone like Tom Steyer or Bill McKibben come along, they seem to, although I think in your debate you did a fantastic job of countering this, they seem to put in your lap a moral imperative, which would block out any reasonable conversation about what's really going on. Am I misreading that?
Well, they are making it into a moral conversation in a very bad sense of that, because what they're doing is they're creating a situation where effectively they've created a God, which is an unchanged climate, which is some magically perfect level of CO2, which was the level that existed before humans and that would exist had we never existed. They're basically saying that's the perfect climate. That's allegedly an unchanging, stable climate, which is nonsense. And then they're saying anything we do that changes that increases those CO2 levels, that is immoral, and we should just stop it. So if we're doing anything to increase those CO2 levels, we should just, as they say, keep it in the ground. And this is just a total dogmatic nonsense, because the way you should think about CO2 levels and anything else is what's the best policy toward them for improving human life, for improving human flourishing, for having a better human environment. And because fossil fuels are so essential to people's lives, they are the fuel that powers every other industry that allows us to be productive, to be prosperous, to take care of our health, to clean our water, to have better medical care, to have everything good imaginable, including to have a safe climate, to protect ourselves from the naturally dangerous climate. Because the CO2 is connected to literally the engine of all of our productivity and prosperity, we definitely need to be willing to accept higher CO2 levels in exchange for all those benefits. And if somebody cares about higher CO2 levels, if they think that's a big concern, then they need to figure out a superior or equal alternative in terms of energy that doesn't produce those CO2 levels. But you can't tell people sacrifice energy. That just means sacrifice your life. We can much more deal with global warming than we can deal with global energy deprivation. Global energy deprivation, we know we experienced it for 100,000 years. That leads to a life expectancy of 30. Global warming, if we have a lot of energy, we can do tons of stuff about it. And the biggest revealing thing is that not only are they indifferent to all the benefits of fossil fuels, but they are positively hostile to the technology that has by far the best chance of replacing a lot of fossil fuels functionality, which is nuclear power. Nuclear power has basically been criminalized in this country to be many times more expensive than it was decades ago. Even though it's empirically the safest form, it doesn't emit CO2, and this is the key, it's an on-demand energy technology. That means you can rely on it, you can activate it whenever you need, versus the sun and the wind, they're not available most of the time. They're not on demand. They're just erratic. So you can't power a civilization on erratic energy. You can power a civilization on on-demand energy, and yet the so-called environmentalists support only the erratic energy, and they oppose the on-demand nuclear, and for a whole bunch of pseudoscientific reasons that are exactly as valid as this claim that they're somehow going to pollute the air with coal dust with these completely covered and sealed cars.
Which brings me to this question, because from a political perspective, you have to do what has to be done in order to get a project passed. The argument has been made, hey, there is no example of a rail line running covered coal cars in the United States. Is that true?
I don't think that's true. I haven't looked into the details of this in a while, but this is, I believe they have an agreement to run them, even if they weren't covered. The point is really that there are uncovered cars all over the place, and people aren't dropping like flies, and people are totally tolerating it because it's not that big a deal. But in this case, they're taking extreme precautions and committing to them. So what are they claiming that covering them is going to make them more dangerous? If ever, and there are already uncovered rail cars that go through Oakland that carry coal. So this is ridiculous.
Can you repeat that, by the way? Can you repeat that, Alex? There are already what?
If I remember correctly, there's uncovered rail cars going through Oakland already.
Wow.
That carry coal.
Interesting. Hey, I found in my research that CSX has a network, a gigantic network of rail lines that run the East Coast, Eastern Seaboard into the Midwest that feature covered coal cars. And there are 3 manufacturers that specialize in the making of such cars. So they're out there, folks. They've been used for years. And the idea that was advanced by one publication in Oakland, name I will not use, is completely false. It's completely false.
And I just want to make the point that, can I just make a point about these kinds of claims?
Yes, sir.
Because it's when we're consuming all this input, particularly in this day and age of the internet, where it's just an ocean of people claiming things that contradict one another and claiming extreme things, and you get attention if you claim something extreme. Mm-hmm. There's a real question of how do we process these? And one of my keys to processing things is I look at, is the person making this claim, are they really sincerely thinking about the lives of the people that they claim to care about? So if you think that there's some concern with this coal car, the covered car rather, is untested or something like that, are these people acknowledging the massive benefits that this will bring to Oakland? Are they acknowledging the massive suffering that people experience, that some of which might be preventable? If they acknowledge all the positives of this project, including the positives of having cleaner air, in part because you're replacing truck traffic by rail traffic. If they acknowledged all the positives of the project and then they brought up some negative, I would look into it if I were you. But if they ignore these massive positives and if they remain indifferent to the lives of people in Oakland, you can be sure that they're just using this to try to scare you. And if they're just trying to scare you and not try to help you, then you can almost guarantee that they're lying or at least exaggerating. So you have to understand, when people make these very unbalanced claims and when they don't look at the benefits of a project, then you know that they don't have your best interest at heart, and you shouldn't listen to them. It would just be like if if you have a massive headache or something like that, and people tell you, oh, they only tell you negatives about pain relievers, but they don't tell you the positive that it'll make you feel a lot better.
Yeah.
Well, they're probably not really that concerned with your problems.
I'm glad you said that, because there have been a number of examples that fit what you say. I'll give you one. I have said to a number of people, why don't you suggest a way the project can be improved? I don't get a response. I don't get a response at all. And not only do I not get a response at all, I then ask this question. I say, well, hey, rather than giving me an answer there, why don't you explain to me this? If the Oakland bulk and oversized terminal isn't built, what do you want to see in its place? And I never get an answer. But then when you look at what those persons who talk negatively about the project tend to talk in favor of, it's market rate housing. And I can go a lot of a step further, but I don't want to dive too deep down that hole. But I'll simply say this. The read that I take from people who don't want the project is that they would rather have more housing that is outside the affordability range of many people in Oakland, and by that help contribute to this homeless problem, because we don't seem to collectively and universally realize that we have an emergency in Oakland, let alone California, with respect to the homeless. And at the same time, it's as if, in my background's in economic development, we've forgotten how to do economic development. And if you go to our, not to go too deep down this hole either, but if you type economic development Oakland now, and you go to the Oakland page, it directs you to a private company that does loans. The city of Oakland had a loan intake program. We had a gigantic staff that handled that, worked with businesses. We've succeeded all of that to some startup, the lifespan of which is uncertain because we don't know if they ran through their VC money or not. That's but one of a number of examples I can provide of how terrible this entire situation has become with respect to the process of producing jobs for everybody, to make sure we have true full employment, rather than a situation where we have in Oakland over 35% of the people underemployed driving Lyft cars, Uber cars, and heavily participating in what's called the gig economy. And Alex, we don't consider that a crisis, and that bothers me.
Yeah, so in general, these are when they're not offering positive alternatives, when they're just finding negative things, when they're ignoring positives, when they're ignoring deep needs, it shows that they're not really trying to help the people. And it's important to know, part of the context of this is that this is part of a global crusade. This is part of a global crusade that believes in opposing any form of fossil fuels in any form in the name of having a perfect climate, in the name of lowering CO2 emissions. It's important to know that this movement that has a practice of going into places and claiming to care about the places, but it's really just focused on this global goal. And we can talk about whether this global goal is well motivated, and I think generally it isn't, particularly as evidenced by the fact that they're anti-nuclear, so they're not trying to achieve a global prosperity with lower CO2 emissions. They're trying to achieve lower CO2 emissions at the expense of global prosperity, and it would be a catastrophic expense. It would set the human race backward, a century plus if they really restricted fossil fuels and nuclear to the extent that they're talking about.
Hey, before you have to go, how are we doing on time, by the way?
I'm good.
Okay, cool. I am quite struck by the idea of where we are, something called carrying capacity for the world. And I have become a practitioner and expert in something called system dynamics. And that goes back to when I was in high school, long story short. But the one aspect of this conversation that I don't see presented much at all is the fact that the rate of births worldwide has actually gone down. Yes, births have increased, but at a dramatically decreasing rate since the 90s. And if you're watching this, folks, you want to read more about this from a system dynamics perspective, I recommend two books. One is called Beyond the Limits by Dennis and Donello Meadows. That was in 1993. And of course, there's Limits to Growth from the Project on the Predicament of Mankind, and the publication was 1971, but I digress. My question is this: how much of this problem is really just us? In other words, if you have too many people in a room, it gets hot, right? I would think as we multiply on the earth, we ourselves have an impact on the climate. Am I wrong?
Okay, a bunch of things there I should say about in terms of system dynamics, and particularly you're mentioning Club of Rome, Limits to Growth. So I talk about that a lot in chapter 1 of the book, and in particular in chapter 8 of the book, and why I think carrying capacity is a fallacy. So I'll address some of that now, but if people are interested in more, they can learn about it, particularly in chapter 8 of the book. Let's look at the general situation. The general situation, if you, I wish I could show this to people live, but essentially you can think of, imagine 4 graphs that look like hockey sticks in front of you. So,
I have the book in front of me. I can actually turn to it.
Okay, so there's early on in the book, I think this is in the book, it might be just something I show in slides. They definitely have, if you search
page 77.
Maybe I don't actually have the book physically in front of me right now, but I'll describe it. If you YouTube Alex Epstein Google, you can see the talk I gave on moral case for philosophy of Google, and this will definitely have it. But essentially, it's like there's a hockey stick of life expectancy. So life expectancy is steady, and then it just goes so far up in the last.
Yep, I've got it right here.
100 years.
I'm pointing right at it.
And then you have a hockey stick of income. So we're living longer, and we have more resources and opportunities as we live. So you have that, and then you have a hockey stick of population, which means that there are more people living. So you have more people. That the number of people goes way up, and then they live longer, and I have more resources. This is an amazing thing because we have this idea: the planet is limited in carrying capacity, but it carries 8 billion people better today than it carried 1 billion people, let's say, 200 years ago, right? We get carried at them. So what's the issue? The issue is the planet doesn't really carry us. The planet is just a background. It has a bunch of raw matter and energy, but the extent to which we're carried is really our ability to transform that raw matter and energy into life, into forms that will help us survive and flourish, including, maybe most importantly, we need to transform energy in unusable forms into usable forms. So whether that's taking sun with solar panels, that usually doesn't work too well, but taking coal and it's just a rock, and then you turn it into energy, and then you can make a Tesla with it, although Elon Musk wouldn't like to focus on that, right? But you can power a Tesla with coal. And we have this phenomenal transformative ability, and the model I was given maybe 20 years ago, I found totally helpful, is that Earth is just a ball of raw matter and energy, and then our unique ability is to turn raw matter and energy into usable resources. And therefore, that's why life can keep getting better. And as long as you keep doing that, and in particular that you keep figuring out how to use energy, because energy is going to power every other form of transformation, every factory, every farm, etc., and make life much, much better. So I'm not worried about too many people. I'm worried about too little human creativity And too little human creativity comes from too little freedom. So to connect this back to Oakland, like one reason why Oakland is struggling, this is true in many respects, but because it's limiting the freedom of citizens in all sorts of ways. So citizens have ideas, they have potential, but in some way they're not allowed to act on that. And with the terminal, you just have this small scale example of people have an idea of how to make the citizens of Oakland more productive and really the world more productive. And then you have this anti-industrial movement, often called the Green Movement, says no. And it's a no movement. They just block. And that prevents people from build. So you have all this potential to build that goes unfulfilled. So at root, this whole idea of there's too many people, that's the wrong idea. There's too little freedom. And when we do have freedom, we have no trouble producing more than we consume. And also, we also replicate ourselves at reasonable rates. When we have freedom, we don't have like 20 kids. In part, we have birth control and we have planning and all those other things. And in fact, the real problem that a lot of civilized countries are having is that they're having too few kids. They're having population decline. So the solution to all of this is to liberate the human mind and human creativity by giving the people freedom, including the freedom to build things. And we really need to disempower, really need to castrate the whole green movement. I don't mean it literally, but in terms of their power from Steyer and Gore on down, those people, because they are castrating the people of Oakland in like a very strong sense. They are limiting their potential because they're against them building. They're against them developing. They always have a reason why you're not allowed to do something. And their whole ideal is that, we shouldn't be changing anything. And if you're against changing things, you shouldn't be a human being.
It's a kind of conservative movement in a way.
That is exactly. I just want to highlight that. It is conservative in the worst sense. The biggest conservatives in the world are environmentalists because they believe not just in conserving a tradition, which is sometimes good, sometimes bad. They believe in conserving a configuration of the planet in which human beings live to 30. Right? They think we should conserve a planet that's hostile to human beings. Can you imagine if you gave a lion an alternative and you said, hey, like lion, I can give you an environment where there's plenty of food and where you're going to be safe, or I can give you an environment where you're going to starve. Of course, the lion would take the better environment. But the environmentalist says, no, let's take the worst environment. Let's take the environment of the past. Let's not change it. Let's not develop it. And let's just suffer all together for what? For the sake of dirt, for the sake of like lions, it's not even for the sake of anything. It's ultimately a nihilistic movement. It's nothing. It's just really Alex, they hate human beings.
I just want to real quick clarify system dynamics. What I was talking about is not so much a finding, because when I say I know system dynamics is from modeling paradigm, which you could present pretty much any argument, right? The idea is to understand it better. But the point that I was making was that what seems to be lost is the fact that it would seem the population of our planet, and you kind of alluded to this, is we have decreasing birth rates. It's up to, I think, 1.02, the lowest it's ever been in recorded history, according to my recent analysis. And then on top of all that, and you pointed this out as well, technology is allowing us to live better. So my point is, it seems like we're actually taking care of the climate problem without even realizing it. And it may very well be our own declining rate of growth on Earth on top of the application of technology. Okay. That is, you see what I'm getting at?
Yes, but I still think there's too much. So I view everything in human terms fundamentally. So I look at all of nature and how it works in the system, but I'm focused on being optimized for human beings. I'm not optimizing it for mosquitoes.
Gotcha.
Or for anything else. For me, the climate problem, the fundamental climate problem, is how do we make the climate as livable as possible for human beings? And the natural climate is no solution, because the natural climate is not sufficiently livable. That's why all the primitive religions pray to weather gods, because the natural climate is so unstable and so unsafe and so volatile, so variable, so vicious, and our capabilities are so low that we're just totally at the mercy of it. So really, the climate solution is industrialization. That's what I call climate mastery. Figuring out how to take this naturally dangerous situation and make it far safer. And the way we're doing that is we build up our capabilities, we build up our infrastructure so that the same thunderstorm that would wreck us 200 years ago, we can now watch during a romantic evening at a restaurant because we've mastered it so much. And when we're looking forward at issues in the future, we need a can-do attitude. We should be if we're concerned about more climate dangers for whatever reason, then let's figure out how to master climate even more. Let's try to figure out how to neutralize hurricanes. I mean, that should be the kind of aspiration that Elon Musk had, not create a coal car and then pretend it's powered by solar and then claim that that's going to solve everything. Like, why don't we actually focus on how to become better human beings, better masters of climate, versus either these symbolic things, which Tesla largely is, or even worse, these non-symbolic sacrifices like sacrificing people in Oakland, sacrificing people in Asia for the sake of lower CO2 levels, but at the cost of the very energy that makes their lives possible.
What is your thought regarding how, if you were to say to Oakland, and this was your shot, how do you want Oakland residents to think about the Oakland bulk and oversized terminal?
I want them to think of it as an urgent first step toward becoming a more productive and prosperous and opportunity-filled city. So, of course, you should endorse this and tell all of these other people to go to hell and to leave. And I mean, by the way, this is already something they have a contractual obligation for. So Oakland is completely screwing itself right now in terms of reputation. And you think, like, if you want opportunity, you do not want to be in a city that has a bad reputation for being a place to do business. That's anyone making an investment, they have to discount the investment if you're a bad place to do business. So I would kick all those politicians out of office, kick in all the interlopers who are claiming to care about your interests, get this thing approved for sure, but then really think about how Oakland can be a leader in development. And maybe this key concept is it's a good thing to be an industrial leader. It's a good thing to build. It's a good thing to develop. That makes life better, and it makes our environment better, and it makes the world a better place for human beings to live. So if you want Oakland to be a better place to live, they need to be pro-industry and pro-development and recognize these so-called environmentalists. They're not making your environment any better. They're making your life worse because they don't care about your environment. They care about the environment of mosquitoes or dirt or whatever, but they don't care about you. So, yeah, tell them to go to hell and live on their own dirt farm, but stop letting them ruin your lives.
Alex Epstein, I know you're a busy man, and you're giving us more time than you probably want to.
Can I make one plug?
Actually, you know what? This time is yours.
In more resources. So
yeah, this is your time.
I do a couple of
Absolutely.
things regularly where I share information about these kinds of issues. So if these broader issues of energy progress, industrial progress interest you, we have a website, industrialprogress.com, and you can sign up for a newsletter. We have a once-a-week newsletter on Wednesday. We have a week, and that'll sort of give you a lot of developments about these kinds of things. And if you sign up for it now, then next Wednesday you will have a link to this recording. So I just want to thank you, Zenny, for inviting me. This is one of my favorite interviews I've done, and
thank you. I appreciate that. Thank you.
I liked your general questions, but in particular, I'm really glad to have an opportunity to talk about this project. I have an interesting history with it because part of the work I do sometimes is energy companies that I agree with on a project or different projects will sometimes hire me as a consultant to help them with their messaging and their language. And I tend to be pretty persuasive on these things. And I only help if I agree with it. But I haven't, a few years ago, I helped with this, and I haven't worked on it since. But when I worked on it, I had a rule that I wouldn't publicly talk about it because I was being compensated. But I told them, like, once I stop working on this, I'm looking forward to talking about it just as a private citizen. So now that I'm years removed from it, I'm really happy to be able to talk about it and have no financial connection to it. except that I'm a human being who lives in California. So if this project goes forward, then I'll benefit. But certainly those of you who are close to the project, it's a slam dunk, and it's you should fire all of the people who are trying to stop this.
Yeah, and I think as everybody knows, as any 62 Media, I've known Phil Tagami for 30 something years, and they brought their story to me because the mainstream media would not tell it. And as anybody knows, I've been a proponent of this project for quite some time. So, this is just a continuation of something I've been involved in for a heck of a long time. Going back to 1993, Oakland has dropped the ball on this. We can move forward, and we need to go back to doing economic development, to making jobs that people can do who don't know programming languages like Swift, which I happen to be learning right now, or any other programming language. We got to get back to taking care of people rather than taking care of our own narrow ideologies. There's a big difference. I want to have you back, Alex. You got to come back, man.
All right. Well, I hope that we make some progress on this issue. So, yeah, if anyone wants to contact me, by the way, individually for whatever reason, my email is alex@alexepstein.com. I hope that in my own little way, this helps that project. And if there's anything I can do in general, I would like to get involved, because this is a very clear-cut example of, are you for progress and industry and human flourishing, or are you for blocking and stagnation and not changing anything?
Oh, and by the way, the moral case for fossil fuels is available on Amazon, and I'll provide a link to it at the end. After the end of this broadcast, I'll add it into the description area where you can get a link to buy this great book, and I suggest you read it. It will challenge you. And also, Alex, thanks for having a great conversation. A great substantive conversation is what we need about this. Not something where people are calling each other names, as I've been called, or someone else told me this. I have a quick question for you before you have to go, if I may.
Sure.
A person, a local friend, swore. She says coal is on the decline around the world. It doesn't matter. Nobody's using it anymore. Can you shed some light on that?
Yes, I don't have all the data in front of me, but essentially over the last decade, what's the fastest growing source of energy in the world? You can probably guess since I'm asking the question, is coal. But in absolute terms, in terms of how much power is actually being added to people's lives, coal is the fastest growing. Now, there's a year recently where China went down and they make promises, but at the same time, they're building some huge number of new coal plants. But in general, the situation in the world is this. There are 7.5 billion people. All of us need energy that's cheap, plentiful, and reliable to flourish. 3 billion of us have virtually none of that. Fortunately, you and I on this call don't have that problem. But a very large percentage of the people in the world have virtually no energy. Many of them have no electricity. Some of them are using wood and animal dung to heat their homes and to cook their food. It's that primitive. So there's a desperate need for more cheap, plentiful, reliable energy. There are only 3 known ways that have any track record at all in doing this, in providing this. The only 3 technologies are hydroelectric power, which the Green Movement opposes, which is good, but it can only be used in certain locations where you have the right kind of water situation. There's nuclear power, which the Green Movement has criminalized, which that's totally preventing its growth. And then there's fossil fuel power, which is coal, oil, natural gas, and that provides 85% of the world's energy. So the other things you have are primarily solar and wind, but those are erratic sources of power that are parasites on reliable power. That is, there's no such thing as a solar panel grid or a wind powered grid. Those always need life support by a reliable form of energy. At most, they can be a supplement, and they're a very unreliable supplement. It's like having, your unreliable brother-in-law who comes into work 1/3 of the time. Yeah, you can have a couple of people like that at your office, but you're certainly not running Amazon with that kind of thing, and you're certainly not running a global economy with erratic, unreliable power. So we have a movement, the Green Movement, that's against hydro, that's against nuclear, it's against fossil fuels. So it's against human life. It's a very deeply anti-human movement. So specifically, yes, because of the energy situation, because there's such a need for energy, and because coal, oil, and gas are so uniquely good, and also because the green movement is crippling the best alternative nuclear, yeah, of course, demand for coal is very strong. But these people opposing this project, they're not concerned about the well-being of the project. I mean, come on, these environmentalists, are they some amazing investors who can forecast like global commodities? And even if the coal demand went down, they can transport other things. So this is, again, a situation where they're not concerned about the well-being of the people they claim to care about. They're just looking for any excuse to oppose this project, even though that will harm the people they claim to care about. So don't worry about low coal demand. Worry about low productivity, low freedom, low development in Oakland. That's what people in Oakland should be concerned about.
Yeah, and I will add, and I'm not going to mention this person's name, but one of those persons is an investor in a real estate company that has been responsible for evicting people in West Oakland. And I asked people connected with this, I said, hey, so wait a minute. What do you want to put where the Oakland bulk and oversized terminal is to go? Is it market rate housing? And I never get an answer back, no. I said, how do you replace those lost jobs? I have never, to date, received an answer to that question. Think about it. Alex, got to have you back, man.
All right.
Oh, hey, Alex, don't go anywhere. By the way, tell them how to find you on Twitter.
Oh, on Twitter. So my name's Alex Epstein, so it's just @Alex Epstein. And since you guys are on YouTube, I realized we have a lot of YouTube videos, and my YouTube is /improve the planet. And hopefully you get that, because the idea is we don't want to save the planet from human beings. We want to improve the planet for human beings.
Hey, don't go anywhere, Alex. I'm going to talk to you off camera. Hey, everybody, thank you. And please subscribe to Zenny62 on YouTube. Bookmark this. Bookmark oaklandnewsnow.com. And follow me on Zenny62 on Twitter. All right, we'll see you. Okay.